All right, let's turn in our Bibles to Genesis 33. It's always good to be learning. As I went back and restudied through this series here that I've been working my way through. It is a series that I've preached, I can't remember. It's probably been about 15 years ago at another church in another location. As I pulled the sermon this week for this chapter, I looked at it, and the Lord just looked at it and says, there's some things that you were missing. And so I began to earnestly try to begin to put things together in this passage. And the Lord gave me some insight, some understanding, some things that I hadn't seen before, and some really changed a little bit of my perspective in this particular passage on Jacob and his life. There's some things here that were kind of confusing, and we'll kind of go through that, and I'll mention a couple of those tonight. But as we get started, let's just go ahead and read through our text here in Genesis chapter 33. We have 20 verses here. And Jacob lifted up his eyes and looked. And remember, this is directly after he had wrestled with the Lord there at a place that he called Peniel. Jacob lifted up his eyes and he looked, and behold, Esau came, and with him 400 men. And he divided the children unto Leah and to Rachel and unto the two handmaids. And he put the handmaids and the children foremost, and Leah and her children after, and Rachel and Joseph hindermost. So you can kind of see there, I think there's no argument on that you can see his favoritism here along his children there, and the order of importance to him. He would have put Rachel and Joseph last, the favored wife and the favored child. Verse 3. And he passed over before them and bowed himself to the ground 7 times until he came near to his brother. And Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. Oh, what a beautiful reunion that must have been of brothers there. You know, sometimes when there's quarrels and when there's disagreements among folks that we truly love and our family members, it's really good to get back together, is it not? We're going to talk about that tonight here a little bit. Verse 5. And he, that's Esau, lifted up his eyes, and he saw the women and the children, and said, Who are those with thee? And he, that would be Jacob, said, The children which God hath graciously given thy servant. Then the handmaidens came near, and their children, and they bowed themselves. And Leah also with her children came near and bowed themselves. And after came Joseph near and Rachel, and they bowed themselves. And he said, this is back Esau speaking, What meanest thou by all this drove which I met? And he said, These are to find grace in the sight of my Lord. And Esau said, I have enough, my brother. Keep that thou hast unto thyself. And Jacob said, Nay, I pray thee, if now I have found grace in thy sight, then receive my present at my hand. For therefore I have seen thy face, as though I had seen the face of God, and thou wast pleased with me. Take, I pray thee, my blessing that is brought to thee, because God hath dealt graciously with me, and because I have enough. And he urged him, that's Jacob urged him, and he, Esau, took it. And he said, this is Esau, Let us take our journey, and let us go, and I will go before thee. And he, this is Jacob speaking, said unto him, My Lord knoweth that the children are tender, and the flocks and herds with young are with me. And if men should overdrive them one day, all the flock will die. Let my Lord, I pray thee, pass over before his servant, and I will lead on softly, according as the cattle that goeth before me, and the children be able to endure, until I come unto my Lord, unto Seir. And Esau said, Here's a second attempt. Let me now leave with thee some of the folk that are with me. And he, Jacob, said, what needeth it? Let me find grace in the sight of my Lord. So Esau returned that day on his way unto Seir. And Jacob journeyed to Succoth, and built him a house, and made booths for his cattle. Therefore the name of the place is called Succoth. And Jacob came to Shalem, a city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan, when he came from Padanaram, and pitched his tent before the city. And he bought a parcel of a field where he had spread his tent at the hand of the children of Hamor, Shechem's father, for 100 pieces of money. And he erected there an altar, and called it Elelohe-Israel. And so here we have our story here of Jacob's meeting with Esau, and what transpired during their meeting, and then immediately after what happened there with Jacob, and in a couple places that he went. So we'll come back to 33. That. We have this wonderful narrative of Jacob coming back and God helping Jacob to get things right with Esau. I think it's so important for us to work at getting things right with one another, making sure things are right between us and those around us. I'm titling the message, Enemies No More. In 1806, a girl was born. It was a famous author, a famous poet. Her name was Elizabeth Barrett. She was born in England. As a youngster, she had a childhood accident with a spinal injury and some lung issues, and it led to some major health issues throughout her life. But she began writing poetry around the age of 11 and is best known for her love poems. So guys, you need some love poems? You go find it, Elizabeth Barrett there, all right? Perhaps her most famous sonnet line begins with, how do I love thee? Let me count the ways. All right, some of you may have read that. With that, in 1845, she published a collection of poems which contained some lines which praised the author Robert Browning. Robert Browning heard about that and was kind of intrigued by that, and he wrote her a letter in response, a letter of thanks, January 10th, 1845. I love your verses with all my heart, and I love you too. And thus began a love affair between the two. They began writing back and forth, 573, they tell me, love letters, and began a courtship that was done in secret because her father was overbearing, and it's been said that he told his children that if any of them married anyone, that he would disown them and disinherit them. He was a man of great wealth and great riches along those lines. I don't advocate being disobedient to mom and dad, advocate praying along those lines, but nonetheless, they went forward with this secret relationship. They were married in secret on September 12th, 1846, and they moved to Italy, where she never saw her father again. It was said that she wrote to her father weekly without ever receiving a reply. Her father, true to his word, had disinherited Elizabeth, as he had promised to do with all or any of his children who married. She wrote every week for 10 years without a response from her daddy. 1 year before her father's death, she received a box from her father. She was pretty excited about the box, but then when she opened it, that excitement turned to anguish as she found every one of her letters that she had written to her father in that box unopened. What a tragedy. What a shame between a family, between a father and a daughter who could have had such a wonderful relationship. You know, Jacob, as we've been following his life through this passage or through the book of Genesis here, Jacob had spent much of his life focusing on himself, focusing on what was best for himself, what I want, what I desire. We see that he manipulated his brother. He deceived his father. And then even when he was on the run there, when he was on his way up to his uncle Laban's house, he made a deal with God. And so here he is. Jacob had not built very good relationships with those people that were around him. But in chapter 32, something happened in Jacob's life. He had that moment there where he was left alone with God in chapter 32 and verse number 24. And there he wrestled with a man, with him until the breaking of the day. And we, again, believe that that was an Old Testament appearance of the second person of the Trinity, the Son of God. And remember, this person, though he could have prevailed against Jacob probably at any time, being the Son of God, being all-powerful, he let Jacob wrestle with him until the break of the day. He was long-suffering. He was patient with him. And then finally, as the day began to break, he touched the hollow of his thigh. He weakened Jacob mightily and caused Jacob to fall to the ground and to crumple as his thigh was out of joint as he wrestled with him. And there Jacob stands clinging to all that he has. And as you study this passage, you get this idea that perhaps he was wrestling with God, perhaps even over the relationships with Jacob, or with Jacob with Esau. Remember, he's on his way in chapter 32. Look back with me in verse number 6. The messengers returned to Jacob, saying, "We came to thy brother Esau, and he cometh to meet thee, and also 400 men with him." Then Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed. And so we see that he hears that Esau is on his way to meet him, and he's got this stress, he's got this burden because this relationship with his brother is not right. The last he had heard and seen of his brother, Esau had pledged to kill him after his daddy died. After dad's gone, I'm coming after you. I'm going to take care of you. And so Esau was eaten up with bitterness and hatred and malice and anger toward his brother. And Jacob was fearful and afraid because of what he had done and the way he had gone about getting the blessing. By the way, it was always God's intention to give Jacob the blessing. The Bible tells us that. They just went about it in the wrong way. And Isaac himself didn't believe God in that. And so here, he has a divided relationship with his father. He has a divided relationship with Esau. He has a divided relationship with God. And here he is wrestling with God here in chapter 32. And he says, God says, "Let me go, for the day breaketh." And he said, "I will not let thee go, except thou bless me." And God said unto him, "What is thy name?" And he said, "Jacob." And he said, "Thy name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel, for as a prince hast thou power with God and with men, and hast prevailed." And so Jacob he surrendered to God, he clung and he held on, and in his weakness, he realized that his strength could come from God. And so Jacob here is beginning to be a changed man. Verse 30, Jacob realizes, he asked this individual his name, and he blessed him. And Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, for I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved. And God left him with that limp, the halt in his thigh, that he had touched his thigh with, the crippledness with that, to remind Jacob there of his weakness in the presence of God's strength. Well, now we come to chapter 33, and Jacob lifted up his eyes, and he looked, and Esau came. So now he's got to deal with Esau. Paul, as he was getting towards the latter end of his life, he uttered these words, the Apostle Paul. And herein do I exercise myself to have always a conscience void of offense toward God and toward men. Paul says, look, I strive, I paraphrase it in the 21st century. The Apostle Paul says, look, I work hard. That's exercising, right? When you exercise, you got to put some effort into it. He says, I'm going to put my effort, I'm going to put my exercise into making sure that my conscience, there's nothing in it that there's something that's offensive between me and God. That there's nothing in between that I know of, that where I have offended God, where I have caused a rift or a division with God. And then also toward men. I'm going to work hard, I'm going to exercise. And I'm going to determine to make it a priority in my life that there's not going to be something between me and someone else. That something that I haven't done that has caused offense, I'm going to make sure that I get that cleared up, that I get that taken care of, that my conscience is clean and clear about that. It doesn't mean that we don't make mistakes, right? Many of us make plenty of mistakes. In fact, I think of the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul, early on in his ministry, got frustrated at Mark. Remember that? He had taken Mark on one of his missionary journey, and right in the middle of the missionary journey, Mark up and left and went home. He abandoned the journey. And Paul got frustrated with him, and he's like, look, I don't have any use for that any longer. I want somebody that's committed. I want somebody that's faithful. And you and I would want the same thing, right? None of us would want somebody, wouldn't want a teammate that would just give up on you, right? I mean, those of us that like to watch sports, what would it be like if, we've looked and scoffed at, I've seen some even in the past year. There's a quarterback that just said, look, I'm right in the middle of the game, right? He's playing the football game right in the middle of the game. He's like, you know what? I'm tired. I don't feel like playing anymore. And he took himself out of the game. I mean, as a teammate, what do you think? This is like, man, that's horrible, right? I mean, we all mess up along those lines. And so Paul got frustrated at Mark over this thing. But at the end of his life, he realized, he's like, look, bring Mark to me, for he is profitable in the ministry. He understood. Paul wasn't a perfect person. But what is he saying? Look, I want to make sure that there's nothing between myself and God, first of all, the vertical relationship, and then myself and those that are around me, that I haven't done anything that I know of intentionally to offend somebody along those lines that's causing them to stumble. So tonight I want to look briefly here at just the thought of enemies no more. Enemies no more. I want to look at the forgiveness, a couple aspects of forgiveness that we find in the passage. Number one, I want us to see the grace of forgiveness. The grace of forgiveness. I titled it The Grace because forgiveness is a grace. Forgiveness is, when you and I forgive somebody or somebody forgives us, it's not something that we deserve. It's not something that we can work for. Sometimes we feel like, all right, I'm going to do penance and I'm going to make that up to that individual because I want them to. No. True forgiveness is a grace. It's a gift that's not deserved or earned. And here in our passage, look with me in verse number 8 of chapter 33. As Jacob had approached Esau, remember previously in the previous chapter, he had sent all of these animals, right? All of these flocks and these herds in front. And so he kept, in waves. I think there's at least four waves, right, of these presents that Jacob was trying to offer to Esau. And so here in verse number 8, and he, Esau, said, "What meanest thou by all this drove which I met?" What are all these presents for? And look at Jacob's answer. And he said, these are to find what? Grace in the sight of my Lord. And so Jacob here, previously, this is even before, I believe, it was before he wrestled with God there. In his own flesh, he was trying to buy the grace of his brother. He was trying to buy the forgiveness of his brother. He was trying to appease his brother's wrath. But look at Esau's answer here in verse number 9. And Esau said, what? I have enough, my brother. Keep that thou hast unto thyself. Wow. He's like, I got enough. And so, as we think about forgiveness tonight, we want to think about the grace of forgiveness. How is a person to come to forgiveness? And I wrote down three elements of this forgiveness that we can find here demonstrated in this passage. Number one is humility. Humility. I mean, you think about this. If Jacob had approached Esau, and it didn't matter how many presents that he gave to him, or sent how many flocks and how many animals and how many gifts that he sent to him, if he approached him with a snippety attitude, with a prideful attitude, with maybe a blaming attitude about Esau's life, would there have been reconciliation? Would there have been forgiveness? Forgiveness came not because of the gifts that were given. Forgiveness came because of the humility that they both demonstrated here toward one another. Jacob bowed himself to the ground, here verse number 3, 7 times until he came near to his brother. We see him bowing himself. And then, after he met him, each of his family bowed themselves before Esau. And then they referred to Esau as their Lord. In other words, somebody greater, somebody mightier than them. They submitted to him along those lines. In order for there to be forgiveness, there needs to be humility. There needs to be true humility in order to come to forgiveness. I think of the one thief on the cross there. Actually, the two thieves contrasted one another. The one was on the cross, and he was there mocking our Savior. He was mocking him and just giving him a dress down. And the other one's basically paraphrased, look, why are you doing that? You and I deserve to be we deserve the punishment that we're receiving. This man hath done nothing. Pointing to Jesus Christ. What humility that thief demonstrated. In order, he got the forgiveness that one, asking for Jesus to remember him when he came into his kingdom there. And Jesus said that he would there. Jesus saved that thief on the cross. Why? Because he was willing to humble himself and see his need there and see that he was in need of forgiveness, where the other thief didn't have any need of forgiveness along those lines. So we see element number one of the grace of forgiveness. There needs to be humility. But element number two, there needs to be a love. There needs to be a love. True love is desiring the best for the other person. Now the devil likes to redefine love as in something that makes you happy, right? And that's more of a lust or a desire along those lines. True love is choosing to do what is right on the behalf of another person, right? That's what true love is. And I put desiring the good of another. And we see that in this passage. Jacob here offered a gift. God had blessed him along those lines. Look at verse number 10. And Jacob said, Nay, I pray thee, if now I have found grace in thy sight, then receive my present at my hand. He's like, look, God's blessed me. In other words, Jacob remembers and he knows that now that God has passed on the covenantal blessing, his familial covenantal blessing onto Jacob's life. Isaac had pronounced it and spoken it to Jacob there. And then Jacob there, remember, as he fled there and he met God at Bethel, where he saw that vision of the angels going up and down that ladder there. And God reiterated his covenant to him. And there Jacob kind of doubted his covenant a little bit. He's like, all right, I'll believe it when I see it. If I come back into the land and you've done all that you've said, then you'll be my God, right? Along those lines. But God has done what he said. God's been faithful. And Jacob now understands the covenant blessings of God. And he's, look, I want to share these covenant blessings with my brother. I believe here he's not just, I believe he's there and he wants his brother to take those blessings because he has been blessed from God. He desires the good for his brother Jacob here. And so, again, my mind, as I approach this passage, again, there's tension, obviously, in Jacob's life between the flesh and the spirit. And I had seen, I thought in my earlier days, again, Jacob in this passage going back to his flesh, but I really feel like Jacob has turned the corner here. It's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but he's turned the corner. And you see just some elements here of doing that. God had answered the prayer. Look with me here in verse number 10 as well. Receive my present at my hand. This is an interesting little phrase. For therefore I have seen thy face as though I had seen the face of God, and thou wast pleased with me. I believe he's referring, that's a play on words there, back to chapter 32 as he wrestled with the Lord. And what did he say in verse 30 of chapter 32? I've seen God face to face and my life is preserved. I believe he was wrestling with God again over the fact that he was going to have to meet his brother and the fact that he was scared and he was fearful over these things. And God had promised that he would have favor, right? For as a prince hast thou power with God and with men, and hast prevailed. And so what is Jacob saying here in chapter 33 as he meets his brother? He's saying, hey, as I look on your face, I see the face of God because God has worked in your life. That was something supernatural. For Esau to be able to put all of those things behind him and to come, and in verse number 4, Esau ran to meet him, not to kill him, not to have harsh words with him, not to have a conversation, but to embrace him and to hug him and to kiss him. And they wept together. That was God's working in Esau's life. And Jacob saw God's face by what God was doing in Esau's life. Is that interesting? Hey, there's sometimes that you and I, we get into a situation with somebody that we care about or somebody that's around us, maybe a family member, maybe a coworker, and try as we might, we can't bring the situation to peace. And maybe you and I, we've tried to be the peacemaker in that situation, but that situation just won't be resolved. Can I tell you this? If you'll pray and ask God, God can intervene, and God can turn the heart of mankind. And I believe that's what Jacob was saying here. I've seen God at work in your life. Just as I saw God face to face there, up there wrestling with him, I'm seeing God working in your life. And what a wonderful truth that is. And so we see humility, we see love. here. But the love wasn't just on Jacob showing love to Esau. I believe Esau was showing love to his brother as well. In verse number 12, Esau suggested, let us take our journey and let us go. I will go before thee. Hey, I want you to go with me back to my home. Let's spend some time together. Esau is showing his brother some love. I will lead the way. Look at verse 15. And Esau said, when Jacob said, look, I have a bunch of children, and I have a bunch of animals that can't go as fast as you can travel, and so let me come behind a little bit. So Esau said, let me now leave with thee some of the folk that are with me. And he said, what needeth it? Let me find grace in the sight of my Lord. Esau's, look, I will leave some of my servants with you to help you along the way. So Esau's trying to invest into Jacob's life. Now, originally I saw, man, those are Jacob kind of puts him off a little bit here, right? I can do this myself. But you know, as I started to think about that, and I looked at something from a different perspective, Jacob declined Esau. Think with me in this passage, what had just transpired. Where did Jacob leave from? His uncle's house, right? Padanaram. How hard had he journeyed to get to where he was, right there by the brook Jabbok? How hard? Until Laban caught up with him. Remember, he was trying to book it. Some believe that he was traveling 30 miles a day. I mean, he was pushing his family, and he was like, look, I can't push them any longer. He realized their need. So I believe that, as I'm looking at this, there's a different perspective that I've just came upon. You know, look, Jacob understood what his family was going through, and they were probably weary and worn out here. And so he needed to stop, and the place he stopped there, he turned aside there, and he made booths. In verse number 17, the place is called Succoth. Literally, the word Succoth means booths. He built a house, and he was letting his family rest. Remember, how old is his children? His children are really young at this point in time. There's some debate, and I intend to maybe look into it a little more. I don't know how important or not important it is. With that, there are some Bible students that believe that Leah and Rachel were giving to Jacob right at the beginning of those 7 years, and he didn't have to wait 7 years with that. There's some wording along the scripture. But nonetheless, whether they were born then or even if they were born later on, you know that they were very young, and they weren't able to travel as fast and as hard along those lines. So we see here the grace of forgiveness. We see some elements of humility, of love, but I also see an element of faith. I see an element of faith. On several occasions, Jacob was reminded, look at verse number 11 of our text. Take, I pray thee, my blessing that is brought to thee, because God hath dealt graciously with me, and because I have enough. It's interesting, that word enough in verse 11 is different than the enough that Esau had in verse number 9. That's an interesting play on words there. Literally, the enough in verse 11, Jacob says, I have all things. I believe he understands the covenant now a little bit better about what the covenant is along those lines. And he says, look, I want to share with you with what God has blessed me with all things on. And we certainly know that God had been blessing him. And so Jacob demonstrates faith in his God. Faith that God was going to take care of his needs. Faith here, he even there's a little subtle change here in chapter 33. Yes, he lined his children up, his handmaids there, and then Leah and her children, and then Rachel and Joseph behind them. But did you notice something? He went before them. he went before them to meet Esau. So Jacob's beginning to demonstrate faith. That faith doesn't happen. Faith is something that grows, right? The disciples said, "Increase my faith." Our faith is something that we're to move from faith to faith. Paul tells the Romans, right, along those lines. And so our little bit of faith that's demonstrated needs to blossom and bring greater faith into fruition. And I believe Jacob's faith is growing in this. And in that, we see with humility and love and faith, I'm gonna trust God. You know, when we forgive somebody, or when we seek forgiveness, whichever side of the coin that we're on, it takes all three of those things, does it not? It takes humility. It takes love. And it takes faith in God. That God's going to take care of the circumstance. That God's going to, if there's any vengeance or retribution, that God's kept a record and He's going to take care of those things. That we're just going to forgive that individual. What a beautiful picture that is. But my second aspect of forgiveness that we're going to look at tonight, I only have two main points: the grace of forgiveness, but second of all, the blessings of forgiveness. I want you to see just a couple of the blessings of forgiveness, and then I want to talk a little bit about this passage and set the table for moving forward in the book of Genesis here. Some blessings of forgiveness. Couple blessings I have down here. Number one, freedom from guilt. Freedom from guilt. You know, when we have done something, when we have wronged somebody, and we haven't sought forgiveness for that wrong, we will live often under guilt, which brings weight into a person's life, and it brings bondage. You see a classic example of this in King David's life when he committed adultery with Bathsheba and when he ordered the execution of Bathsheba's husband. And then he hid it. We see in Psalm 32, you can read about it, we won't do so tonight, in Psalm 51 there, that David, his bones begin to shrivel up within inside of him. He began to have a weight and a guilt that brings a life into bondage. You just have this guilt hanging over you. By the way, God's given us this guilt. God's given us guilt in order to be able to make sure that we get right with Him, first of all, and those that are around us. And then, once we've gotten something taken care of with Him or with somebody around us, the devil wants to administer false guilt in our life. He wants us to continue to feel guilty. But the Bible says in 1 John 1:9, if we confess our sins, He is faithful, God is faithful, and He's just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. And so if you've gotten that thing taken care of with God, or you've gotten that thing taken care of with that other individual, you've come to them, whether or not they've forgiven you or not, you've approached and you've tried to bring reconciliation and you've done what God has asked you to do, you don't have to live underneath that guilt and bondage any longer. Isn't that a wonderful truth? Satan wants you to continue to feel, hey, all right, look at your past. What was that old saying? When Satan reminds you of your past, you need to remind him of his future, right? Look, if we've gotten the things settled with God, if we've gotten things right, or we've attempted to get things right with those that are around us, you don't have to live under guilt. You should not live under guilt. It's forgiven. God's restored that relationship. Don't base your living off of feelings of guilt. Say, look, God's forgiven me, and I'm a child of God. And in humility, move forward along those lines. And so it brings freedom, the blessings of forgiveness, it brings freedom from guilt. It brings freedom from worry, having to live our life looking over our shoulder at every turn, right? Jacob had a bunch of guilt, right? and he had a bunch of worry. We saw that, we read about that in chapter 32, the chapter previous, when he heard Esau was coming with 400 men. Immediately his mind went to, I'm in trouble. I'm a dead man. Right? Because he was worrying. Why? Because he hadn't gotten things taken care of at this point in time. And the minute that got taken care of, and verse number 4, they ran and they met each other, they embraced, they hugged each other, they kissed each other, and they wept together. You see, it didn't talk all. I'm sure there was a conversation that went along with that. Perhaps they says, look, let bygones be bygones. I forgive you. And they probably wept over those things with one another. They both were weeping together, not just one of them. But they were reconciled, and it brings freedom. No longer does Jacob got to look over his back and wonder when Esau's going to get him. And so it brings freedom from guilt. It brings freedom from worry. The blessings of forgiveness also bring fellowship. These two, they were reconciled together. They were reconciled together. And all things are of God. This is Paul speaking to the Corinthians, who hath reconciled us to himself by Jesus Christ. So first of all, God wants to reconcile himself to us. He wants us to be reconciled to him. Isn't that what salvation is? Salvation is us getting back into a right relationship with God. Our sin has destroyed that relationship. We're born with that sin nature. And when we receive Jesus Christ as Savior, we're reconciled to God with that. And so, he hath reconciled us to himself by Jesus Christ. And, so that's the vertical relationship, and hath given to us the ministry of reconciliation. Hey, that's a great thing to be reminded of. You and I are here to help, not just the vertical relationships, that is first and primary, but we're to help the horizontal relationships. You and I are to help families to get back together with God's help. We're to help husbands and wives. We're to help children and parents. We're to help those that the devil wants to divide. Along those lines. And so we see they were reconciled together. They were restored. They were restored. Verse 14 says here, let my Lord, I pray thee, pass over before his servant. I will lead on softly, according as the cattle that goeth before me, and the children be able to endure until I come unto my Lord unto Seir. All right. It was like, well, Jacob didn't go to Seir. The passage doesn't tell us that. And I was like, yeah, I grabbed a hold of that. I was like, many Bible students believe Jacob was reverting back to his old self here and telling a lie to Esau of what Esau wanted to hear. And Jacob never had any intention of going to Seir, because our text from here to the end of Genesis, the end of Jacob's life, we're never told that he went to Seir along those lines. And that's what I was like, all right, yeah, perhaps Jacob's struggling with that. But perhaps there's a different answer. Perhaps there's a different answer that I want to give you tonight that will help perhaps it helped unlock a little bit in my thinking with that. At the end of chapter 33, we see Jacob, verse 17, journey to Succoth, which was that would be on the west side of the Jordan River. He hadn't passed over the Jordan back into what we know as Canaan yet. It was just a few miles from where he had met Esau there. But he stopped, and he built a house, and he made booths for his cattle. All right? So we see that. Verse 18. Jacob came to Shalem, a city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan. So now he's crossed over the Jordan River, and now he comes to just outside of the city of Shechem in the land of Canaan, and he pitched his tent in the city there, and he bought a parcel of a field where he'd spread a tent, and it tells you who he bought it from, and there he built an altar, which we'll talk about here as we close. All right, so he didn't go to Seir, all right? In this text, turn with me over to chapter number 35. Chapter 34 deals with an incident there in Shechem, all right? Chapter 35, and God said unto Jacob, arise, go up to Bethel, and dwell there, and make an altar unto God. So then he leaves, and he goes to Bethel, and he comes full circle. Remember, that's where he met God in the first place when he was fleeing. And he comes back, and he has an encounter with God there at Bethel, chapter 35. Look with me at the end of chapter 35 in verse number 27. And Jacob came unto Isaac, his father, unto Mamre, unto the city of Arba, which is Hebron, where Abram and Isaac journeyed. And the days of Isaac were 104 years, 180 there. And so, all right, so now we're told that he goes to Mamre and Hebron, right, to visit Daddy along these lines. And so I've always seen this as sequential. All right, he went to Succoth. He went to Shechem. Then he went to Bethel. And then he went to Mamre. But it was inserted into my thinking, and I think the material or the person that I was reading and had done some studying on this, and I'm going to show you the trail here, that these stories that God put in His Word are not chronological. And I'm going to show you here in a minute. The theory is that Jacob likely settled in these couple places, in Succoth, on the west side of the Jordan, and there he bought a piece of land there just outside of Shechem. And he likely settled his tribes, but he likely spent some time traveling during these years. Let's take a little Bible study journey, and then we'll be done. Look with me, and we'll start in Genesis 35 in verse number 29, where I had taken you. And Isaac gave up the ghost and died, and was gathered unto his people, being old and full of days. And his sons Esau and Jacob buried him. All right, according to the previous verse, how old was Isaac when he died? 104 years, which is what? 180, all right, good, all right. 180 years old, all right? All right, notice Jacob and Esau were together when they buried him at 180. All right, doing the mathematics, all right, throughout the Genesis, Isaac was likely 137 years when Jacob left to go to Padanaram, to Uncle Laban's house. And likely Isaac was 157 years, 20 years later, right, when Jacob left to come back down toward the land. So how many years does that give between the time that Jacob came back and the time Isaac died? 180 minus 157? 23 years, all right? That's a fairly long period of time with that, all right? It was made mention, truth. Jacob had so many flocks. We read about those. Jacob was blessed by God over and abundantly. He was rich in flocks and in herds along those lines. They likely would have need to have been spread out in various places. You couldn't just have them all in one place. They wouldn't be able to feed them all. And so likely he had flocks in different places. Could have been, a flock in part of his flock there in the booths that he built in Succoth, and the house he built. And then in the land he bought there near Shechem. Very, very clearly. Maybe some other places that we're not told about. Notice, Esau had great flocks and herds, But he also seemed to have come back and was living in Canaan. Look with me in chapter 36 in verse number 6. And Esau took his wives and his sons and his daughters and all the persons of his house and his cattle and all his beasts and all his substance, which he had got in the land of Canaan, and went into the country, where? From the face of his brother Jacob. Why? Verse 7, for the riches were more than they might dwell together. All right? So, at some point in time, Esau's come back across and is living in the land of Canaan, and his stuff, his animals, his herds are multiplying, and they too just can't live together. Kind of like Abraham and Lot, along those lines. They needed to separate, and so Esau went back over to Seir with that. All right, let me give you a couple other thoughts with this. All right, when we get to chapter 37, all right, look with me in Genesis 37. We get introduced a little bit more for the next few chapters to Joseph. Joseph would have been the youngest of the children other than Benjamin, right? The youngest of the children that was born in Padanaram, all right? Could have been as he could have been as young as 2 years old when they left Padanaram there, doing the chronology of all the children. Might have been a little older, depending upon the chronology of when exactly Jacob was given his wives, along those lines. But listen to this, or look here in the text. We're told here, and the brethren went to feed their father's flock in Shechem. Oh, actually, go back to verse 2. These are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brethren. All right, and his brethren went to feed the flock in verse number 12. Where? In Shechem. Oh. So, Jacob still has a portion of his flock where? In Shechem, in the land that he had bought, right? That we had looked at the end of our passage. So, again, there's some years, quite a few years that passed by between Jacob coming and buying that and Joseph here going along those lines. By the way, it's interesting, I didn't realize this, Isaac would have still been alive when Joseph was taken captive into Egypt. You do the math. He had a few years left, but Isaac would have still been alive with that. All right? All right, let's go back as we kind of wrap this up. In Genesis 34, we're not going to deal with it in this message, but in Shechem, we find that God inserts this story. That's why I'm saying that this story is not chronological. Because in this story, Simeon and Levi massacre a well-to-do family in retributive anger. Their sister got raped and taken, right, there, and the people of the land wanted to marry her. We'll deal with that perhaps when we get to the next chapter here a little more in detail. And in retributive anger, Simeon and Levi hatched up this plan and killed their family. And because of that, Jacob and his family had to exit. You can see that here. Go with me to the end of chapter 34 and verse number 30. And Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, ye have troubled me to make me to stink among the inhabitants of the land, among the Canaanites and the Perizzites, and I being few in number, and they shall gather themselves together against me and slay me, and I shall be destroyed, I and my house. And they answered, should they deal with our sister as a harlot? And so they asked the question there. But the point is, this story here in Genesis 34 seems to have been inserted by God so that we understand some things, but it wasn't in a chronological order. of where, all right, he went from Succoth to Shechem to Bethel and then down to Hebron to visit his dad. It seems like he set up camp for his flocks, and he was able to travel in various places to go visit his dad, for instance. If that were the case, the Bible doesn't tell us one way or another, but could Jacob not have gone to visit his brother and fulfilled his promise to Esau to visit him in Seir for a while? Perhaps he went to Seir, and perhaps they both came back together. I don't know. The Bible's silent on those issues. And so now understanding the fact that things aren't as chronological as I thought they were through these series of chapters, I'm looking at Jacob in a little different light with this. I don't think I hate to get to heaven and make a false accusation against somebody that wasn't true, right? Along those lines. God doesn't say that he lied in this passage, and Esau doesn't seem to be bothered about him not showing up. So I think we can reasonably assume, perhaps, that Jacob did show. So as we look at this passage tonight, we look at just the fact of enemies no more. In Genesis 33, we find that Jacob has been reconciled to Esau. We see that Jacob has been reconciled in chapter 32, and then again in chapter 35 as he meets with God at Bethel. He's been reconciled to God himself. By the way, that's so important. And then by the time you get to the end, it seems like he's had some reconciliation that's went on. He's went down to visit his daddy and had some reconciliation perhaps with his dad. You can see Jacob's beginning to turn. Let's leave you with this thought. Let's go back to our text, chapter 33, and let's look at the last verse. You can kind of see Jacob's mentality beginning to change. That's why, again, I began to rethink, again, the fact of perhaps that Jacob is not manipulating Esau in this passage. Because look at verse 20. After he buys that land there in Shechem, he erected there an altar and called it what? El. That's the Hebrew word for what? God. Elohe, or Elohim, which is the Hebrew word for the plurality of God, right? With that, the word Elohim is used in the book of Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God, Elohim, bara, created the heavens and the earth, right? Heaven and earth. So, and then he uses the name that God had given him. This is a beautiful, I believe this is a beautiful picture. It's a beautiful representation of where Jacob's heart is. He creates this altar, and he calls it God, the God of Israel. Well, who's Israel? That's Jacob. Up until this point, Jacob's been referring to God as who? The God of my fathers. Here, he said, this is the God of Israel. Isn't that exciting? I think Jacob, again, you just begin to see his faith begin to blossom and begin to just grow as a seedling in his life here. And then we get to chapter 35, and I believe chapter 35 is chronologically right after chapter 33 here, where God comes to him and says, look, I want to meet with you down in Bethel. And I want to talk with you a little bit about there. We got some business to finish at Bethel. And chronologically, I believe he goes down to Bethel and it does some of these other events that God instructs in his word. As we move forward and study and we look at this, God is the one that wants us to reconcile. He wants us to have forgiveness through humility, through love, and through faith. And we know that true forgiveness brings freedom from guilt, and it brings freedom from worry, and it brings fellowship of reconciliation and restoration with those that are around us. And that's who our God is. The devil, on the other hand, comes in, he wants to divide, he wants to destroy. And when we get to chapter 34, I believe what one of the purposes is that it's there is that Satan is trying again to destroy the righteous, godly line by getting the world involved with the children of God and intermixed and intermingling with that. And I believe the devil's trying again. He's doing everything he can to destroy the righteous, godly line that God has chosen to raise up a seed. He's trying to pollute that seed, and he's trying to prevent that seed ever from coming to pass. And I believe that's why God inserted chapter 34 in the line of Shechem. Here's what happened at Shechem along those lines. And so, Lord willing, we'll get to that next time. But may God help us as we leave tonight, as we think about just some application. Forgiveness. Sometimes we're in the need of someone to forgive us. Sometimes the other person's in the need for us to forgive them. But in either case, we need to have humility. We need to have love. And we need to have the faith of God to be able to go forward, to experience the blessings of forgiveness that God provides. Heavenly Father.